Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now through this latest season of Fund Drive. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, October 14th, 2023. We begin with author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston and Freedom Now co-producer Dr. Gerald Horne will be joined on the line by Professor Alex Borucki, professor of history at the University of California at Irvine and co-author of the recent article in the William and Mary Quarterly entitled The Impact of the American Revolutionary War on the Slave Trade to Cuba. Then, in the second half of our program, we'll be hearing from Jean Pfaelzer, Professor of American Studies at the University of Delaware, and for our purposes today, author of the book, California, a Slave State. No doubt, these will be two conversations that will expand your knowledge base on some key perspective in America's rich history of oppression. But we're not done yet. We would also like to invite you all to Push, Pedal, and Pump, a screening and workshop series about surfing, cycling, and skateboarding in Southern California. Join us for this event that will feature a special in-person screening of the documentary Wade in the Water by David Mesfin, and also highlighting none other than our very own Freedom Now founder, Baba Didan Kamati. This event will be tomorrow, Sunday, October 15th from 7 to 10 p.m. in the garden in Lamert Park next to Aki Bamboo. So come through, show your love, and pay homage to the legacy and tradition of Black surfers. Now, while we are in Fund Drive and still are able to bring you this much quality content, context, and perspective, we want to remind you to call 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735, or go online at kpfk.org and pledge your support to the station at any level. Remember, these are all tax-deductible donations, and you can take home one of our fantastic premiums from the library of Dr. Gerald Horne, available for your donation of $100 or more. These signed book copies cover various topics, and Dr. Horne's going to tell you a little bit about what you can expect to get today.
Pledge $100 to receive a signed copy of the new book, hot off the presses, I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne reader. Return to those thrilling days of yesterday and yesteryear and read a scintillating analysis of the Watts Revolt of 1965 and the LA Rebellion of 1992. Read about the massive global anti-apartheid movement that delivered South African independence by 1994, one of our most significant victories of all time. Read of the exploits of the most underrated and underpublicized of our Black women activist intellectuals, speaking of Shirley Graham Du Bois. Read an analysis of why the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s was a devastating defeat for Africans and African Americans from which we have yet to recover. Read about why the escapade in Ukraine by US imperialism will probably accelerate the rise of China to global preeminence and accelerate the ongoing crisis of white supremacy. Read an analysis of the close relationship between Black Americans and Japan that led directly to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, a direct outgrowth of this tie. Read an analysis of the concept of the lumpen, popularized by the Black Panther Party, which was then bequeathed to Compton's iteration of, quote, gangster rap, unquote, and the morphing of the very term gangster into everything from a noun to a verb. And read of why left-wing white nationalism is one of the more persistent ideological problems the broader left and the Black liberation movement have yet to confront. But wait, there's more! Pledge $100 and receive a signed copy of yet another book, hot off the presses, Acknowledging Radical Histories, Conversations with Gerald Horne. Read analyses of settler colonialism, the pernicious system which continues to oppress us. Read of the history of the music we call jazz and how it has provided a clarion call for inspiration and revolt. Read of the lives of past giants like Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois. But wait, there's still more! Pledge $180 to receive 2 signed copies of 2 new books, I Dare Say and Acknowledging Radical Histories. Pick up the phone and call
818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735, and make your pledge today to support our efforts here at Freedom Now. Now I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org streaming live on the web. To make sure that we stay on the smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Black Star, Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, Stanton Moore, Gato Barbietti, and Philippe Saiss. Now people get ready for this train to come and taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for that conversation with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Alex Borucki.
From Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, KPFK, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now, and with me on the line is Alex Borucki, Professor of History at the University of California at Irvine in Orange County, and co-author of a recently published article in the William and Mary Quarterly entitled The Impact of the American Revolutionary War on the Slave Trade to Cuba. Welcome to Freedom Now, Los Angeles, Professor Borucki.
Thank you very much, Professor Horne. This is a pleasure to be with you.
And it's a pleasure to have you. So why did you write this article in the William and Mary Quarterly, or co-write it, I should say?
Yes, I work with a Spanish historian, José Luis Belmonte Postigo, and we were working together on a book on the whole of the slave trade to the Spanish Americas from about the time of the American Revolutionary War to 1810. And also, we were working also in adding information of this horrific traffic in the Slave Voyages website, the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, the Inter-American Slave Trade Database. While we were doing that, we have another historian, Michael Suske, who had found from his contacts in Havana part of this, or I would say the main bulk of these primary sources regarding to the arrival of slave ships in Havana during the American Revolutionary War. And we haven't seen this before. Belmonte is more a specialist that I do on Cuba. We check everything and nobody have seen this voyage by voyage, ship by ship data. So we say we have to write on this. We have to write particularly on the importance of U.S. slavers, meaning shippers of captives coming from the United States, who went to St. Thomas and other places, especially within the Caribbean, to ship captive Africans to Havana during the war. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So the consensus in the United States is that 1776, the secession of the 13 colonies from the British Empire, fed abolitionism, fed the tendency towards abolishing slavery. How does your article comport with that historical consensus?
Well, that is a narrow view of the United States history, only centered on things happening within the United States. This article shows merchants from Charleston shipping captives to Cuba very early in the 1780s. And I'm gonna give you something new. I'm working right now on Venezuela for this book with Belmonte, and we found a US privateer from Charleston also disembarking captive Africans in Venezuela in 1778, even before these these shipments of enslaved Africans being brought into Cuba by US shippers. The war itself was a context for the formation of commercial networks between US shippers, in this time particularly from Charleston, but later from Rhode Island. Merchants in the Danish West Indies were already some US shippers were working and were established, and merchants in the Spanish Caribbean that started with the war only in Cuba, but then spread in the 1790s, and it would have continued without a doubt if the abolition of the slave trade in 1808 by the United States limited a little bit the action of US slave traders. This was a thing that was becoming hemispheric. This meaning this participation of US slave traders in the overall shipping of captives across the Americas, but particularly in the Spanish Empire.
Now, let me follow up on that last response. You say that the abolition of the slave trade in the formal sense by the United States in 1808, quote, limited, unquote, this kind of commerce.
Yeah.
By saying limited, do you mean to suggest that this odious commerce continued after 1808?
Oh yeah, of course, the US participation of this traffic continued, but it was not mainly based in the US, but these US slave traders helped Cuban slave traders in Havana and in other ports, Brazilian slave traders in Rio de Janeiro, and you even have this participation going all the way to the last of the slave ships. That's part of the work of, I think it's John Harris' book, The Last Slave Ships, of a network of mostly Portuguese and Spanish slave traders based in New York City. that arranged some of the last slave voyage that set sail across the Atlantic Ocean, going as well to Cuba, indeed. Yeah. It limited in the sense that U.S. merchants were less able to organize slave voyages from the United States. They had to move to Cuba, they had to move to Rio de Janeiro, and they were more on the not on the driver's seat, but on the accompanying seat of Cuban slave traders or Luso-Brazilian ones. That's the sense of the limitation, let's say.
Mm-hmm. So could you elaborate on the role of Charleston, South Carolina, and Rhode Island in terms of the slave trade to Cuba?
Great. What we found with Belmonte was a kind of triangular trade, but triangular Caribbean trade, connecting Charleston, Bermuda, and Havana. You know how winds flow in that area of the Pacific. It's very easy to sail from Charleston to Bermuda. It's very easy to sail from Bermuda to Havana, and from Havana to Charleston as well. And we found that some of the dynamics of the war, like Charleston ships and merchants and privateers participating in the Spanish conquest of Nassau on the Bahamas early in the 1780s, shape some of the commercial partnerships in which merchants from Charleston, some of them established in Bermuda, or some Bermuda merchants established in Charleston, created this merchant partnership, and indeed they moved enslaved Africans from the Danish West Indies into Havana.
Do you have any idea from what part of Africa did U.S. enslavers grab captives? Was it present-day Senegal, present-day Nigeria, present-day Congo, or what?
Well, that question leaves from, because this traffic was mostly within the Caribbean, we think that these Africans mostly came from the Bay of Biafra through British transatlantic slavers that disembarked them in the smaller islands, like the neighboring island of St. Thomas, Tortola, and I'm missing one name of one of those small islands near British islands near Puerto Rico. And from there, either the British or French or the US slavers moving to St. Thomas to make the ship either a US ship or a Danish ship, and from there to Cuba, to Havana, indeed. So it's very close to think that most of them will have come from what is today eastern Nigeria, the Bay of Biafra, the main enslaving ports of that area, like Bonny or Calabar, indeed.
Mm-hmm. You also write or suggest that the so-called patriots, those who led the war against the British Empire and formed the United States, increased their enslaving tendencies during wartime, but you suggest that the British enslavers, by way of contrast, increased their enslaving tendencies during times of peace. How do you explain that difference?
That is explained because of the slave trading policy of the Spaniards that allowed the entrance of allies or neutral powers during war. So when Spain was at war with Britain, which was a lot during this period, this allowed this foreign neutral, like the Danish, or sometimes ally, like the US during the American Revolutionary War, merchants to enter into Spanish colonies. And that's why this thing that we see in this traffic of captives that we see in a smaller scale during the American Revolutionary War in the early 1780s this partnership between the Danish and the US grew exponentially in the 1790s and in the first decade of the 19th century, when the US slave traders were the main providers of enslaved people for Cuba up to 1808, sometimes alone or sometimes in combination with the Danish, which it may be a little bit of a detail. Much of these Danish slave voyages that we found were manned or were organized actually by U.S. merchants. So the Danish flag was something of a flag of convenience for these slave traders, and also in the 1790s, and especially in the early 1800s, as a result of this allowing the U.S. entrance into Spanish ports, we see U.S. merchants trying to ship captives to Cartagena, to Venezuela, and principally into the Rio de la Plata region, what is today Argentina and Uruguay. When they became actually in the early 1800s the main transatlantic slavers.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, Professor, but the inference I'm drawing is that the Spanish in their empire, Cuba, Venezuela, Argentina, etc., that they were hostile to London. They wanted to strike a blow against the British Empire, and so therefore they supported George Washington and his comrades, who then accumulated capital, accumulated money through which they could fight the British by accelerating the slave trade. Is that a fair inference?
Yeah. A Spanish silver funnel into the early U.S. and the French Navy, when it went to Georgetown, it was carrying also Spanish silver that they just picked up from Havana. The gross, that's how you pronounce it. I'm imagining me pronouncing English, trying to pronounce French through English. But yeah, this Spanish silver was the main financial means during the war, indeed.
Mm-hmm. You also suggest that scholars previously had been deficient in analyzing the U.S. partnership, as you've suggested, with the Spaniards, with the Danish. Why do you stress this?
Because of the difficulty of this research. First, you have to be multilingual. You have to read Spanish documents, but also you have to engage in other historiographies as well. The way that U.S. history is made in the United States sometimes emphasize too much things that only happened within the United States. That's how we end up in that kind of understanding that 1776 was the beginning of abolition for the United States, without seeing these hemispheric events happening in other places that shape how U.S. history took place. It's a complicated research as well, because you have to engage in primary sources that are located in other countries, and you have to engage in other historiographies as well.
Mm-hmm. You also write about the shared history of Cuba and Haiti. What did you mean by that?
We found, for instance, in this article that about a little bit more of a quarter of captives that arrived in Havana during the war came from St. Thomas, but about a quarter of those captives came from Saint-Domingue, from Le Cap, Cap Etienne. And we see a constant communications between Havana and Cap Etienne. And that's something that we wanted to develop more in the article, but we were not able, because you cannot put everything in an article. There were military ships of the Spanish Navy constantly going from Havana to Le Cap, and French ships as well. We were able to identify some of the Spanish Navy ships carrying enslaved Africans from Le Cap to Havana, but most probably there were more. Indeed, because this is hard to find, because usually they were not searched, these Spanish Navy ships, by the authorities in Havana port, as well as merchant ships. So this point about the really close connection between Saint-Domingue, the French Caribbean as well, and Havana, basically less than a decade before of the Haitian Revolution, indeed. And it can give us a little bit of second thoughts about the revolutionary aspects of this, indeed.
Mm-hmm. So finally, Professor Alex Borucki, Professor of History at University of California at Irvine in Orange County, co-author of a recently published article in the William and Mary Quarterly entitled The Impact of the American Revolutionary War on the Slave Trade to Cuba. Is it fair to suggest that this article is part of a larger project, perhaps a book-length project? And if so, could you describe it?
Yes, thank you very much. This is part of a book that I'm writing with the Spanish historian José Luis Belmonte Postigo on the overall traffic of captives to the Spanish colonies from the time of the American Revolutionary War to the starting of the wars of independence in Spanish America, in Argentina, Venezuela, Mexico. It's a complicated research because we have to do research on Argentina, Uruguay, Cuba, Venezuela, Colombia. But what we are finding during those 30 years, 1780s, 1790s, first decades of the 19th century, is the increasing importance of the slave trade within Spanish America compared to the commerce of merchandises, but also the strategic of the traffic of captives in linking the colonies of Spanish Americas, for instance, with the United States, indeed. So you can find this engagement of US slave traders that we find for the early 1780s in Cuba, in other places. To a certain extent in Venezuela in the first decade of the 19th century, and much more in the Rio de la Plata region in Buenos Aires and Montevideo as well in the first decade of the 19th century, indeed. As a counterpoint of all of this is the importance of silver, which is central to the economy of the Spanish Empire, but also central for globalization, as it became the universal means of exchange in the commerce of Europe, the Americas, and East Asia. So we basically follow the money, where those Spanish silver pesos end up. Those Spanish silver pesos obtained through the transatlantic slave trade or the slave trade within the Americas related to the Spanish Empire. Yeah.
Well, Professor Borucki, Professor of History at University of California at Irvine, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Pacifica Radio, Los Angeles.
Thank you very much, Professor Horne.
Special thanks to Professor Borucki for sharing his hard-earned knowledge with us. Where else can you get such quality content, context, and historical perspective other than Freedom Now? Call 818-985-KPFK, that's 818-985-5735, or go online to kpfk.org to donate and support the show by giving what you got today. And you'll be able to get one of our many awesome premiums to expand your library and your mind. So, Dr. Horne, tell the people about what else they can take home today.
Pledge $100 to receive a signed copy of the new book, hot off the presses, I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne reader. Return to those thrilling days of yesterday and yesteryear and read a scintillating analysis of the Watts Revolt of 1965 and the LA Rebellion of 1992. Read about the massive global anti-apartheid movement that delivered South African independence by 1994, one of our most significant victories of all time. Read of the exploits of the most underrated and underpublicized of our Black women activist intellectuals, speaking of Shirley Graham Du Bois. Read an analysis of why the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s was a devastating defeat for Africans and African Americans from which we have yet to recover. Read about why the escapade in Ukraine by US imperialism will probably accelerate the rise of China to global preeminence and accelerate the ongoing crisis of white supremacy. Read an analysis of the close relationship between Black Americans and Japan that led directly to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, a direct outgrowth of this tie. Read an analysis of the concept of the lumpen, popularized by the Black Panther Party, which was then bequeathed to Compton's iteration of, quote, gangster rap, unquote, and the morphing of the very term gangster into everything from a noun to a verb. And read of why left-wing white nationalism is one of the more persistent ideological problems the broader left and the Black liberation movement have yet to confront. But wait, there's more! Pledge $100 and receive a signed copy of yet another book, hot off the presses, Acknowledging Radical Histories, Conversations with Gerald Horne. Read analyses of settler colonialism, the pernicious system which continues to oppress us. Read of the history of the music we call jazz and how it has provided a clarion call for inspiration and revolt. Read of the lives of past giants like Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois. But wait, there's still more! Pledge $180 and receive 2 signed copies of 2 new books, I Dare Say and Acknowledging Radical Histories. Pick up the phone and call
818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. Or go online to kpfk.org to donate right now and make your support for the show and the station felt. Now we're going to keep this train moving and send you back off to Dr. Horne, who's being joined on the line by Professor and author Jean Pfaelzer, right here on Freedom Now.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Jean Pfaelzer, Professor of American Studies at the University of Delaware, and author of the book, California, a Slave State. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, Professor Pfaelzer.
Thank you for welcoming me.
Well, thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book, California, a Slave State?
I was born in Los Angeles. I went through the public schools, went through Hamilton High, did my BA at Berkeley and my MA, and studied with people who I thought were incredible. I learned slavery history from Kenneth Stamp, and nowhere in my education did I know that I grew up and went through public universities and public education to know that California was in fact a slave state, and that for 250 years, from the moment the Spanish invaded at San Diego up through modern human trafficking, there has never been an era where slavery didn't have a tremendous power in California. So the impetus to write it was to tell this untold story. Some of the clues came from my last book, Driven Out: The Forgotten War Against Chinese Americans, where I came to understand the slavery of the deliberate slavery of enslaved Chinese prostitute girls who were kidnapped from the port city of Guangdong, of Canton, and kept in cages on Jackson Street during and after the gold rush, sold from brothels. And that information and the photographs of these girls really haunted me. The other thing that compelled me to really write this story now was reports that were coming out in local newspapers in Northern California of men and women who were being captured from the immigration centers, the detention centers, runaways from foster homes who are being sold into human trafficking, in the sex trade, but also in the fields, in the marijuana grows in Northern California. There is slavery of men in the fields and slavery of women in the trim of the cannabis bushes. And that's happening just now. We're in the harvest time. So wherever I turned or read, whether it was the Indian boarding schools, the missions, the history of San Quentin prison, and the history of the gold rush, where 2,000 enslaved African American men were marched across the plains, and in California they met 3,000 free blacks and launched really the first civil rights movement in California. So this feels like an enduring and a compelling story of slavery and slave revolt.
Now, speaking of slavery and slave revolts, on page 71, you speak about the Chumash Revolt of 1827. This is during the Mexican era, before the U.S. takeover a few decades later. The Chumash, of course, being one of the central indigenous populations of the Southland. Could you speak for a moment or two about that particular revolt of the enslaved?
As you know, the missions are a romanticized and core part of California tourism. The Taco Bell architecture, the mission furniture, and what none of us knew as we were growing up and even raising kids in California was that at every single mission, there were slave revolts. From the very first mission at San Diego, the Kumeyaay people swept down into San Diego, burned the mission, slaughtered the head priest, and freed all their people never to return. That was in the early era of the missions. The Chumash people live in the central part of California along the coast, and they organized a slave revolt that seeped into three missions. Mission Santa Barbara, Mission Inez, Mission La Purísima, and with that coordination, the people who were trapped at those missions, California Native Americans, mainly Chumash, fled into the Tules and were chased by the Mexican military. Mexico controlled California at that time. It won it from Spain, along with its independence. And there was a coordinated slave revolt at those missions where about 1,000 people fled into the Tules to be received and welcomed and protected by local tribes. And they survived there until a trapper brought malaria, and that population of free people actually died from disease in their freedom.
Now, you write mostly about slavery and human trafficking, but this is also a book about genocide. To that end, on page 181, you cite the address in 1851 of then California governor Peter Burnett. This is during the U.S. era, after the United States had seized California from Mexico. And he vowed, quote, that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the two races until the Indian race becomes extinct, unquote. Talk to us about genocide.
The genocide in California, which was operated by the U.S. military, worked hand in hand with the enslavement of Native American people. California becomes a state with a constitution that says slavery will never be tolerated in California. Tolerated. But tolerate is not a legal standard. California's very first law, the Act for the Government and Protection of the Indian in 1850, was linked to the genocide that was ongoing at the time. The genocide implemented by the American military was to clear the land for settlers. As they killed the Native American men and torched the villages, there were thousands of Native American women and children in particular on the run. This law, the 1850 law for the government and protection of the Indian, one of the most hypocritically named laws, was to legalize the kidnap and forced indenture of California Native Americans. So there were people on the run, literally and legally refugees. They called them vagrants. And if you were a vagrant Native American, you were available to be kidnapped and forcibly indentured just by the sign-off of a justice of the peace. That law is 1850. A decade later, they make it even worse, and they allow for children to be forcibly sold and indentured without the signature or acquiescence of their parents. So the whole decade of the 1850s leading up to the Civil War was backed by the indenture, the forced indenture for field labor and domestic labor and sex work of California Native Americans.
You just mentioned the U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 1865, which brings us to this question, that is, why was Los Angeles a hotbed of pro-slavery sentiment during the U.S. Civil War? And I guess you can digress and talk about the enslavement of Africans as well.
I think that the southern part of the state at that time was actually less populated than some of the northern parts of the state that were more impacted by the gold rush. So what we see in Los Angeles was true also in San Francisco and the Bay Area and in Sacramento, which were the roots to the gold rush. So what's happening in Los Angeles is that Mexican ranchers, super wealthy Mexican ranchers, only had to apply to Mexico to get vast ranches, rancheros, and there was no labor force in California. But this was true not only in Los Angeles, but it was true in the Central Valley, and it was true up through Northern California. And so the hotbed, if we're talking about the same thing, of violence and of slavery, came with this desperate pull for an unpaid and enslaved labor force. And the available people were Native Americans. So you have violent prisons, horrific jail systems, and meanwhile, what it's leading up to is also the violence against Chinese Americans that was going on in Los Angeles's Chinatown. one of the largest mass lynchings in American history happens in 1871 in Los Angeles. However, it's important to remember that those lynchings were of free people.
Now, you also write about Mary Ellen Pleasant, who was an anti-slavery activist, I believe of African descent, and she helped to subsidize the campaign by the late martyr John Brown, who in 1859 led an attempt to overthrow slavery in what is now West Virginia. Talk to us about Mary Ellen Pleasant.
People are fascinated by Mary Ellen Pleasant. There are so many contradictions. Mary Ellen Pleasant comes west. She had been likely formerly enslaved in Louisiana, as best as we can tell. But she comes west with money. She was a widow, and she remarries. The man she remarries is what was called at the time a blackjack. He worked on the ships, and the two of them were a 1-2 team of liberation. Mary Ellen Pleasant is important not only for the money and that she gave to John Brown's raid, and she goes to Ottawa. She's part of the very famous convention of abolitionists who gather there to decide to support John Brown's raid. And the amount of money she gave him, nobody knows for sure, but the rumors are that it was either $10,000 or $30,000. My multiplier is 30 when I'm trying to talk about the 1850s, 1860s, what it would be worth now. So that is a tremendous amount of money that she gives to John Brown. As important as that check was what she does in California, because she takes her money and funds the first lawsuits. Black people, Chinese people, Native Americans weren't allowed to testify in court. And so what Mary Ellen Pleasant does with a group of Black freedom fighters is to bring lawsuits to free enslaved African Americans. They were literally legally free the minute they crossed the border, but they didn't know that they were free. So there are famous lawsuits where, supported by free Blacks and funded by people like Mary Ellen Pleasant, that they bring the lawsuits, they win some, they lose some, to free people who were legally already free. So she's known both as a freedom fighter, as somebody who donated money. There are rumors that she continued to earn money by running a chain of boarding houses. Some people claim that they were brothels, but she's working very closely with her husband, who's on the ships, and he's able to tell her and tell the Black community in San Francisco that a ship is about to sail and return, for example, to New Orleans, and that they're going to take free Blacks, kidnap them, and take them back to New Orleans. So they were a powerful twosome.
So you also come into the 20th century, into the present. For example, how does your story connect to California as a so-called carceral state? Our listeners are quite familiar with Folsom Prison, San Quentin Prison, etc.
I believe my book is really one of the first histories of San Quentin Prison. There was crime in San Francisco. There was a ton of money in San Francisco. Every year during the gold rush, $1.5 billion was sent east to the banks, the insurance companies, the shipping companies in the East Coast. There was a great deal of money floating around San Francisco because of the gold rush people wanted to pan for gold. They didn't want to necessarily become merchants. Some very important early civil rights, Black civil rights leaders in San Francisco opened wagon stores, opened boot stores, and decide there's more money becoming merchants than suffering the discrimination and the physical threats of being in the gold country. And they organized the first movements in California for colored conventions, which were happening all over the country, gatherings of Black people, hundreds of Black people, to demand their civil rights. In California, there were 4 colored conventions, 3 before the Civil War, and led by free Black people who've come out to California. That in itself was controversial. Frederick Douglass at first doesn't want free Black people to come out to California. And leaders like Mifflin Wistar Gibbs say to Douglass, 1, we're entitled to the same riches that everybody else from all over the world is coming to gather from California. But 2, we as free Black people have the fugitive slave law at our backs. We have to be out of here. And so there's this movement west of free Black people. They did not expect to find 2,000 to 3,000 enslaved African Americans in California. And people who were brought out to California were not informed that they were free. So they find this out by encounters between free Blacks and enslaved Blacks that neither side expected to discover in the streets of San Francisco, in Sacramento, and an underground railroad emerges in the West Coast with stops like in Sacramento, such as at Hackett House, a Black-owned boarding house in Sacramento, or actually in Mary Ellen Pleasant's home was a place where free Blacks or enslaved Blacks were taken in and hidden. The carceral state then emerges because of crime in San Francisco. California, like every state, is going to build a penitentiary. The contract for the penitentiary goes to this corrupt white guy, James Edsel, and he kidnaps people for petty crimes like shoplifting. And people were poor. A loaf of bread cost $18. So the urge, the need to steal was throughout California. And he corrals these people, kidnaps them, and he puts them on prison brigs. These were ships that sailed to San Francisco with people headed for the gold rush and then abandoned. And he takes 2 of these ships, and he's entitled to the ownership of convicts and the profit of their labor. So he doesn't build a prison, and he sails convicts all over the bay, getting money to build the sewage system for San Francisco, the roads for San Francisco. He leases out prisoners to mansions to work on the mansions. Finally, the legislature calls him to account and says, build this prison at San Quentin. And the prisoners are required to build their own prison. In that prison, Edsel sets up, with the warden, he sets up factories inside the prison. And they were torture factories. You had to stand at a mill to weave burlap bags for the new agriculture. And if you talked during your 12-hour assignment, standing at a loom, I couldn't stand for 12 hours and not talk. If you talked, you were sent into the basement of San Quentin prison and tortured. What I also didn't know is that in the late 1850s, there was a strike against being convict laborers in San Quentin, and 1,000 men go on strike against this forced labor condition. This is well over 100 years ahead of Attica, one of the largest prison strikes in the United States.
Well, Professor Pfaelzer, author of the book, California, a Slave State, we're going to have to leave it there, but I'm happy to report that in your pages, you not only talk about enslavement, but the struggle against it, just as you write about the carceral state, which still dogs us and hounds us today, and the struggle against it as well. In any case, thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Pacifica Radio, Los Angeles.
Thank you for having me.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Professor Alex Borucki from the University of California at Irvine. Thank you also to Jean Pfaelzer from the University of Delaware for joining us on the show as well. Find that Black-owned bookstore you know and love and get her book, California, a Slave State, today. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Hit up your favorite bookstore right now and find one of Dr. Horne's many informative texts to enrich your library and your mind. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our spiritual backbone and Freedom Now founder, Baba Didan Kamathi. Shout out to our marvelous engineer, and last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. We hope to see you tomorrow, Sunday, October 15th from 7 to 10 p.m. in the Garden at Leimert Park to see the late, great Didan Kamathi in the Black Surfers documentary entitled Wade in the Water. Also, please continue to support our programming. We are volunteer producers and the station needs your help to help pay the bills, to keep the lights on in the building and the mics hot for us to bring you this quality content. So please dial 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735, or go online to kpfk.org to donate and support the show and grab you one of Dr. Horne's many amazing premiums. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk, or go to our audio archives at kpfk.org and scroll down to Freedom Now to be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday, here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.